I've indicated, and that's one reason that some contemporary Arab thinkers are really enthusiastic about Ibn Taymiyyah as a philosopher. I don't go there. I don't say he's a philosopher myself, but that some people take him in that direction. The thing I think is most interesting and most important is his temporalization of the divine essence. What do I mean by that?
Yeah.
Yeah?
What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So if we take Kalam theologians like the Ash'aris, God is outside time. God is eternal in a timeless sense. We take Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, the philosophers, in the Hellenistic tradition, God is outside time, God is timeless. And so there's this question then, how do we get from God, and how does God have a will that is active, and how does God create the world when God is timeless? You know, how do we cross that gap? Ibn Taymiyyah solves all that by essentially putting time inside of God. So he doesn't call this explicitly, I'm putting time inside of God. He says God has voluntary attributes. God does things by God's power and God's will. And these are activities. So we have voluntary attributes and voluntary acts. But he does allow that this is equivalent to what the Ash'aris would call putting hawadith in the essence of God. Hawadith, that is temporally originating events, basically time, temporal events inside of God's essence, which the Ash'aris reject completely as entailing a God who is somehow defective, imperfect. Ibn Taymiyyah turns all this on its head and he says a God who is outside of time, a God who is not active and involved in temporal history is imperfect. He's just frozen. Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't say he's frozen, but basically that's what he's implying. Whereas a God who is perfect is going to be active and busy, if you will. So Ibn Taymiyyah's view of God is that God has been acting from eternity, one thing after another, creating things, doing things, speaking. God has been speaking by his power and his will. So God is always active, and this is out of God's perfection. So I think this is a major philosophical, he's making some major philosophical moves here to get to his theological outcome, where God is intimately involved in the historical process, or I think it's more accurate to say God's history is creating the history, our history, because God creates everything, of course, for Ibn Taymiyyah. And we don't need to puzzle over this distinction between time, you know, the lack of time in God, and our temporality. There's a time in God, there's temporality in God, and so God works in time. For example, Ibn Taymiyyah talks about when God gives a command to do something. Then the person does it. Then God learns that the person's done it, not before. So God knows from eternity that person's going to do it, but he doesn't learn that God has actually, he doesn't learn the person's done it until it happens. So there's a sense of which God is not learning. God's knowledge is perfect, but that perfection entails a certain process of being in touch with the historical process, not being removed from it and distant from it and out of touch. So that's another, I think that's the biggest contribution from my perspective. Other philosophical contributions, there's empiricism. You know, he is of the view that if something is real, it's going to be accessible to the five senses. That doesn't mean that everything that exists we can see right now. God, for example. Maybe some prophets have seen God, or somebody has seen God in dreams, but you know, most human beings have to wait until the hereafter to see God. But God is a seeable being with our eyes in front of us, just like you're in front of me, in the hereafter. So it's a sense in which, empiricism, in the sense that everything that exists is accessible to the senses, even if we don't, you know, individually see everything. We're not.
How does it differ from empiricism in Western philosophy?
A big difference is that he includes God. So many people would say empiricism as leading away from belief in God, leading away from a kind of unseen realm. So the unseen realm for Ibn Taymiyyah is unseen. That doesn't mean it's not seeable, given the right conditions. In other words, we wait till the hereafter, or a prophet might have a special vision, or something like that, like the prophet's vision of when he went on the night journey, seeing different stages up to heaven and down to hell and so forth. So that's the unseen to most people. But for a more Platonic tradition, the unseen is something that's outside the empirical realm. And in Western empiricism, once you strip away that unseen, non-empirical realm, you don't have God anymore. Whereas for Ibn Taymiyyah, you have God, because God is seeable. In fact, Ibn Taymiyyah says because God is the most perfect, God is perfect, God is more seeable than we are, because we're not perfect. We're far less than perfect. So when we get to the hereafter, God will be more seeable than you and me, which is a bit puzzling, but that's where he's going. And that's what I mean by his empiricism, in the sense that everything is potentially visible or potentially hearable, if God is speaking. And so that's another contribution. And he's drawing on Ibn Rushd, Averroes in Western terms. So Ibn Rushd is not saying this by any stretch of the imagination. But he does say, Ibn Rushd says that for the awam, for the ordinary people, they basically need to believe something like this. But of course, being a philosopher, he knows better. Ibn Taymiyyah strongly dislikes that kind of distinction between the ordinary people and the elite. Ibn Taymiyyah says the instincts, the intuitions, the knowledge of the ordinary people actually is the right knowledge. What the philosophers are going off about is actually completely wrong. But for Ibn Rushd, though, provides the rationale for the ordinary people's belief in some of his writings, and Ibn Taymiyyah is drawing on that to help him articulate his own views. So those are three different things I think are important philosophical contributions.
We mentioned many aspects of Ibn Taymiyyah. Was he a sectarian?
Was Ibn Taymiyyah a sectarian? It really depends what you mean by sectarian.